The empty highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the desolate landscape. Thomas Reed tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his old Ford F-150, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the night silence. He had been driving for hours, making his way back to Phoenix after a job in New Mexico. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., too late for comfort, but he was determined to push through. The road was lonely, barely a car in sight for miles. Just the occasional road sign and the glow of his headlights bouncing off the dry, cracked terrain of the desert. His only company was the static-filled radio playing some forgotten rock song. Then he saw it. A car on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking in a desperate rhythm. Next to it, a man stood waving both arms, signaling for help. His silhouette was sharp against the red glow of the taillights. Thomas instinctively slowed down, his foot hesitating over the brake. Should I stop? It wasn't like him to ignore someone in trouble, but something about the scene sent a ripple of unease down his spine. The man stepped closer to the road, looking directly at him. A shadowed face, but Thomas could make out short-cropped hair and a desperate expression. His car, a dark-colored sedan, looked like it had seen better days. Its hood was propped open as if the engine had overheated. "Damn it," Thomas muttered. He wasn't the type to leave someone stranded. He turned the wheel and pulled over a few feet ahead of the car, putting the truck into park. Leaving the engine running, he reached for the small flashlight in his glove compartment and stepped out. "Hey, you all right?" he called out, approaching cautiously. The air smelled of hot asphalt and the distant scent of sagebrush. The man nodded quickly. "Yeah. My car just died on me. I think it's the battery. You got jumper cables?" His voice was friendly, but there was something off about the way he stood, too tense, too prepared. Thomas frowned. "Yeah, I got some in the back." As he turned toward his truck, his gut screamed at him. Something wasn't right. He had worked around cars his whole life. There was no reason to pop the hood for a dead battery unless you were trying to fake a problem. Then he heard it. The sound of footsteps behind him. More than one pair. His breath hitched. His hand shot toward the knife in his belt just as a voice behind him said, "Wrong move, buddy." Thomas barely had time to react before something hard struck him in the back. The impact sent him stumbling forward, barely catching himself on the side of his truck. His fingers brushed the handle of his knife, but before he could pull it free, a second blow landed, this time against his ribs. He gasped, pain exploding through his side as he spun around, raising his fists. 2 more men. They had been hiding in the shadows near the stalled car, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first guy, the one who had waved him down, was grinning now. "Didn't your mama ever tell you not to stop for strangers?" Thomas took a step back, trying to position himself near his truck's open door. His engine was still running, if he could just get inside and gun it. "Don't even think about it," one of the newcomers said, brandishing a crowbar. He was taller than the others, with a wiry frame and wild eyes that gleamed in the dim light. "Keys on the ground. Now." Thomas didn't move. His heart was pounding, his brain working through his options. 3 guys. One armed with a crowbar. The other 2. Unknown threats. He could take one of them, maybe even 2 if he was lucky, but 3. The third man, shorter but stocky, pulled something from his jacket. Thomas caught the glint of a switchblade. Shit. His truck was his best chance. "All right," Thomas said slowly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Take it easy. I'll give you the keys." He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the cool metal. The second his hand emerged, he threw the keys, not at them, but over their heads, into the darkness. For a split second, they hesitated. The stocky man cursed and turned to look where the keys had landed. That was all Thomas needed. He lunged for the open driver's door, grabbing the edge and yanking himself inside. His left hand shot for the gear shift. Pain ripped through his shoulder. The first guy had grabbed him, trying to pull him back out of the truck. Thomas roared in frustration, twisting his body and slamming his elbow into the man's face. A sickening crack. The guy reeled backward, clutching his nose. Thomas didn't wait to see the damage. He slammed the door and threw the truck into drive, tires screeching against the asphalt as he punched the gas. The two other men shouted. He saw the glint of metal in the side mirror. The guy with the crowbar was swinging at the window. Crash. Glass exploded inward. But Thomas was already speeding down the road, the night swallowing him whole. Thomas's pulse pounded in his ears as he pressed the accelerator, his truck roaring down the dark highway. His side mirror was cracked from the crowbar strike, but he could still see the men scrambling behind him. One of them was already sprinting back toward their car. "They're not done with me." Sure enough, a few seconds later, headlights flashed on in his rearview mirror. The engine of the sedan roared to life, and tires screeched against the asphalt. They were coming. "Son of a bitch," Thomas growled, gripping the wheel tighter. The road was nothing but a black void stretching ahead, with no exits, no gas stations, no signs of civilization, just endless desert and a moonless sky. His truck wasn't built for speed, but it was tough. If he could just outlast them, maybe he could find a way to lose them in the terrain. A quick glance in the mirror. The sedan was gaining fast. Think. They were at an advantage, they had numbers, and they were aggressive. But Thomas knew something they didn't: this road, these back highways. He had driven them for years while hauling construction equipment across state lines. He knew which paths led where. The first bullet shattered his train of thought, and his rear window. Crack. Glass exploded behind him, raining down on the seats. Thomas ducked instinctively, yanking the wheel slightly to the right. His tires veered onto the gravel shoulder before he corrected and straightened out. "They're shooting at me now," he muttered through clenched teeth. The sedan was now dangerously close, maybe 2 car lengths behind. The flickering beams of their headlights cast erratic shadows across the road. Thomas needed to act now. He spotted a small dirt road coming up on the right, a barely visible trail leading into the desert. He knew it from past trips. It connected to an old service road for a long-abandoned construction site. The path was rough, filled with dips and uneven terrain. His truck could handle it. Their sedan. Not so much. "Hope you boys like off-roading." At the last second, Thomas jerked the wheel hard to the right, his tires screeching as his truck bounced onto the dirt path. Dust exploded into the air, swallowing him in a thick, blinding cloud. For a split second, he couldn't tell if they were following. Then he saw their headlights veer wildly, the sedan skidding as they tried to turn onto the same path. Bad move. Thomas gritted his teeth and floored it, his truck tearing through the uneven ground. His suspension groaned, his tires kicking up loose rocks, but he pushed forward, weaving between dry bushes and the occasional jagged boulder. The sedan wasn't faring as well. In his mirror, he saw it bouncing violently, its low clearance scraping against the rough dirt. It wasn't built for this. Then, suddenly. Bang! A loud metallic thud echoed in the distance, followed by the squeal of tires. Thomas didn't slow down to look. But he knew what had happened. They hit something. Hard. He allowed himself a single, sharp breath. He wasn't safe yet, but he had just bought himself time. Now he had to figure out what the hell to do next. Thomas kept his foot on the gas, his truck bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. Dust billowed behind him, obscuring whatever remained of the sedan's headlights. He glanced in the rearview mirror, no sign of movement. Had they crashed? Given up? He doubted it. Guys like that don't just walk away. His mind raced through possibilities. If their car was dead, they wouldn't stay put. They'd be pissed, desperate, and looking for payback. That meant one thing: they'd come on foot or find another way to hunt him down. Thomas needed to disappear. He couldn't just keep driving blindly through the desert. His truck was tough, but it wasn't invincible. The rough terrain could blow a tire or bust his suspension, and he wasn't about to get stranded out here. Think, Reed. You know these roads. A memory surfaced. About 10 miles ahead, there was an abandoned quarry. He'd passed it before on past hauls, just an old, dried-up pit with a service road leading back to the main highway. If he could reach it, he might be able to hide or find a way back onto the road without them seeing him. But there was another problem. Gas. Thomas glanced at the gauge, a quarter tank left. Enough to keep going for now, but not enough for endless running. He needed to make his next move count. He pressed forward, keeping his headlights off, letting the moonlight guide him. His truck rumbled over the dirt path, the suspension groaning with every dip and rock. The air was thick with dust, settling in his throat. Minutes passed. No sign of pursuit. Had they really given up? His gut told him no. Then, far in the distance, he saw them. Flashlights. Moving. Shit. They were on foot, at least 2 of them, sweeping the area with beams of light. They were looking for him. He could see their faint figures moving along the ridgeline, staying just outside the dust cloud. One of them raised something, a rifle. Thomas's stomach twisted. They weren't just chasing him. They were hunting him. He had to make a decision. Now. Speed up and risk them hearing the engine. Or kill the lights, roll slowly, and pray they lost him in the dark. His fingers tightened on the wheel. One wrong move, and he was a dead man. Thomas clenched his jaw and made his choice. Lights off. Slow roll. He eased his foot off the gas, letting the truck coast forward with just enough power to keep moving. His headlights had already been off, but now he reached down and flicked the dash lights off too, plunging the cab into near-total darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the stars and the occasional flicker of the moon against the landscape. His heart pounded as he watched the flashlights in the distance. The men were methodical, sweeping their beams across the terrain, searching for any sign of movement. One of them pointed. Thomas's stomach twisted. Had they spotted him? No, they were pointing toward the dust cloud. They thought he had kept moving at high speed. He exhaled slowly. Good. Let them chase ghosts. Keeping his truck at a near crawl, he adjusted his route, steering toward a low stretch of land that dipped between 2 hills. If he could get through the gulch without being spotted, he'd be out of their line of sight entirely. But he had to be careful. Too fast, and they'd hear the rumble of his engine. Too slow, and he'd be a sitting duck if they doubled back. His fingers gripped the wheel, every nerve on edge as he maneuvered through the uneven terrain. The truck rocked over a hidden ditch, its suspension groaning softly. He winced, hoping the sound didn't carry. The flashlights in the distance stopped moving. Thomas's pulse spiked. One of them raised the rifle. Are they aiming? For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then. A gunshot shattered the silence. Crack. The bullet wasn't close, it hit somewhere off to his left, a warning shot, maybe, or a blind attempt to flush him out. Thomas didn't flinch. Don't panic. Keep moving. The seconds crawled by as he edged his truck deeper into the gulch, using the natural dip in the land as cover. Another shot rang out. Then, silence. Thomas forced himself to breathe. He had no idea if they thought they hit something, or if they were just trying to scare him. Either way, they weren't following, not yet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he cleared the gulch. He was officially out of their sight. But the night was far from over. He had a head start. He had his truck. Now he just needed a plan. Thomas kept rolling forward, every muscle tense as he listened for any sign of pursuit. Nothing. Just the low hum of his truck and the whisper of the desert wind. He had gained some distance, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. Those bastards were still out there. Armed. Hunting him. His mind raced. What next? The quarry. It was still his best bet. The old excavation site was massive, with abandoned equipment, half-dug trenches, and winding service roads. If he could reach it before they regrouped, he might find a place to hide, or, better yet, a way to turn the tables on them. But getting there wasn't a straight shot. He took a quick glance at the fuel gauge. A little under a quarter tank. Enough for now, but not for much longer. He couldn't afford to waste gas taking the long route. Thomas reached for the GPS on his phone, but the screen was dark. No service. He cursed under his breath. No maps. No backup. Just memory. He thought back to his old hauling routes. There was a service road near here, one that cut straight to the quarry. It wasn't on any modern maps, barely more than an old dirt path used back when construction was still active. If he could find it, he could disappear before they caught up. His fingers tapped anxiously on the wheel. Should be close. Then, there it was. A barely visible break in the landscape, marked only by an old wooden post leaning at an awkward angle. The road itself was little more than packed dirt, with faint tire tracks leading into the darkness. Thomas didn't hesitate. He turned onto the path, his truck jolting as it hit the uneven ground. The ride got rough immediately, but he welcomed it. If it was rough for him, it'd be worse for them. Dust kicked up behind him as he navigated the winding road, keeping his speed steady. His headlights stayed off, relying only on the faint glow of the moon. Minutes passed. Still no sign of them. Maybe they lost him. Maybe they were still searching the open desert. Or maybe. Headlights. In the distance. Faint. Moving. His breath hitched. They found the road. Thomas gritted his teeth and floored it. His truck roared forward, bouncing violently over dips and potholes. No turning back now. The quarry was close. Just a few more miles. He had to make it. Thomas gripped the wheel tightly as his truck thundered down the narrow service road. The dirt and loose gravel made it harder to control, but he didn't dare slow down, not with them closing in. In his rearview mirror, the distant headlights bobbed violently. They were struggling. Their sedan wasn't built for this kind of terrain, and that gave him a fighting chance. But he wasn't safe yet. Up ahead, the service road sloped downward, leading into the abandoned quarry. Thomas had only been here once, years ago. He remembered a massive excavation site, deep pits, skeletal remains of rusted machinery, and forgotten structures. If he could get inside, he might have enough cover to hide, or set a trap. He killed his lights completely. The truck became a rolling shadow, nearly invisible against the rocky landscape. His only guide was memory and the faint outline of the dirt path ahead. The road dipped sharply. Thomas braced himself as the truck plunged downward, tires skidding over loose gravel. He fought the wheel, keeping control as the incline leveled out. The quarry opened before him, a vast, hollowed-out pit filled with abandoned equipment, rusted storage containers, and deep trenches. Perfect. He didn't waste a second. Swinging the truck to the left, he veered off the main path and cut the engine. Silence. Dust swirled around him as the truck coasted to a stop behind a half-buried excavator. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, in the distance, the growl of an engine. Thomas sank lower in his seat. Through the cracked side mirror, he watched as the sedan crested the hill. Its headlights flooded the area, sweeping across the quarry like searchlights. They weren't giving up. The car crawled forward, moving slowly, searching. Thomas held his breath. He had seconds, maybe less, to make his next move. Thomas stayed perfectly still, his breath controlled, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sedan's headlights swept over the quarry, illuminating rusted machinery in jagged rock formations. If they spotted his truck, it was over. The sedan rolled forward slowly, its tires crunching over loose gravel. The beams of light danced closer. Too close. Thomas knew he couldn't just sit there. He had to move. Carefully, he reached for the door handle and eased it open silently. The moment his boots touched the ground, he crouched low and slipped into the shadows of the excavator beside him. The sedan stopped. Doors creaked open. Thomas pressed himself against the cold metal of the machine, listening. Footsteps. At least 2 of them. Maybe 3. A voice, low, angry. Where the hell is he? He's here. Truck's still warm. Thomas's jaw clenched. They knew. He scanned his surroundings, searching for an advantage. His truck was useless now, it would give away his position the second he tried to start it. But the quarry was filled with hazards. Crumbling ledges, deep trenches, rusted-out equipment. If he could lure them into the right spot, he could turn this around. Thomas spotted what he needed, a stack of old, unstable pipes leaning against a skeletal storage container about 20 yards away. One good push, and they'd come crashing down. First, he needed to bait them. He reached down, feeling for a loose rock, then hurled it across the quarry. Clang! The sound echoed, bouncing off the metal and stone. Over there, one of them shouted. Footsteps quickened, moving toward the noise. Thomas stayed low, circling wide, using the shadows to his advantage. He reached the pipes just as the 2 men reached the other side of the container, guns drawn. He didn't hesitate. Using his full weight, he shoved the stack. For a split second, nothing happened. Then. Crash! The pipes collapsed with a deafening roar, slamming down in a twisted avalanche of metal. One of the men barely had time to shout before he was buried beneath the wreckage. The other stumbled back, cursing. Thomas didn't give him a chance to recover. He charged forward, grabbed the man by the collar, and drove his fist into his jaw. The guy crumpled to the ground, out cold. 1 down. 1 trapped. But there was still one more. A gunshot rang out. The gunshot snapped through the night like a whip, the bullet slamming into the metal storage container beside Thomas. Sparks flew. He dove behind a stack of wooden pallets, his breath ragged. The 3rd man was still standing. And he had a gun. Reed, the voice snarled. You think you're smart, huh? Thomas clenched his jaw. They knew his name. That meant they'd either found his ID in the truck or had been watching him longer than he thought. Neither option was good. He peeked around the edge of the pallets. The gunman stood near the wreckage of the collapsed pipes, using the flickering sedan headlights to scan for movement. His stance was aggressive, but his hands were shaking slightly, not a professional, just another thug trying to act tough. Thomas had one advantage, he was hidden. The quarry was filled with cover, but he couldn't stay pinned down forever. His eyes flicked to a rusted toolbox lying near the base of an old crane. Inside might be something he could use, a wrench, a crowbar, anything. But it was 10 feet away in the open. Risk it? Or wait? Another shot rang out. He was out of time. Thomas lunged. He sprinted toward the toolbox just as the gunman fired again, bang. A bullet whizzed past his shoulder, kicking up dust. He hit the ground hard, skidding beside the toolbox. His fingers scrambled inside, cold steel met his grip. A wrench. Heavy. Solid. Good enough. The gunman was reloading. Thomas didn't hesitate. He pushed off the ground and charged. The guy barely had time to react before Thomas swung the wrench with everything he had. It connected with a sickening crack. The man collapsed. His gun clattered onto the rocks. Silence. Thomas stood there, chest heaving, gripping the wrench so tight his knuckles went white. His ears were still ringing from the gunfire, his adrenaline surging. It was over. He stepped back, scanning the scene. One unconscious. One buried. One out cold. No more threats. He grabbed the fallen gun, checked the ammo, half a clip left. Enough. Then he turned back toward his truck. He still had a long drive ahead. But next time someone waved for help on an empty highway, he wouldn't be stopping.